Now, full and proper discussion about locking down the network would probably take another 45 minutes, so I'm not going to go into the weeds here. I will point you to the fact that in the security documentation that we were looking at earlier on, there are in fact tutorials. Configuring Linux IP tables firewall for MongoDB, and actually IP tables is actually a gateway into another firewall, but yes, IP tables or UFW on Ubuntu, very common way to lock down a host. Generally you won't just be doing it for MongoDB, you'll be doing it for other things on the host like SSH access and other stuff like that. The equivalent on Windows, the NetSH firewall interface, that's how you lock things down on Windows, and these are just generic guidelines. Of course it changes from environment to environment, and what you need to know to be able to do this correctly, it sounds like a very generic question, but what needs to talk to what? You know, which pieces need to talk to each other? That kind of thing. And this is the kind of question you'll get from a network operations engineer or security, NetSec engineer when they're looking to apply firewall rules, or you're just trying to do due diligence yourself and have your MongoDB instances as locked down as possible. And generally, the answer is just about everything's going to need to talk to everything else. So let's draw out a typical sharded cluster, shall we? So you've got your MongoS's, you've got your config servers, you've got your applications, you have your shards. So let's consider what we know. Let's consider what we've discovered throughout this series of lessons that we've gone through. We've talked about various different things talking to each other throughout the course of this, which is why in some cases I've left this towards the end of the course, is because you kind of need to know what's going on under the covers to be able to determine what needs to talk to each other. I'm just going to draw some of these in different colors so it's a little bit easier to see. So obviously the applications need to be able to talk to the MongoS's, okay? And for those of you who are familiar with firewalls and the rules that you apply therein, you'll know that directionality is important. What do I mean by that? Well, opening a connection from this app server to this MongoS, let's say they're different physical boxes. Opening that connection from here to here is different than opening a connection, and I'll do it in a different color just to make it really obvious, is completely different from opening a connection from here to here. And that in turn is different from opening a related channel back. So these blue and green ones could be considered related. Okay, so in other words, there needs to be bidirectional communication. You need to send a query, get data back. Okay, so in other words, this is opened and this connection goes back, but the two of them are essentially relatable. Okay, whereas a completely separate instantiation of a connection between the MongoS and the app server is something completely different. Okay, so you'll have different rules governing that behavior. So when I talk and draw arrows, the directionality basically matters here. Okay, so for example, in this case, you would want to allow the application to open up connections to the MongoS, otherwise how would you send queries? And you do need to allow the related connection back for the MongoS to return data. So that's good. That's fairly straightforward, you know that. There's not going to be any reason for the MongoS to open a connection back to the app server itself off its own bat. They'll all be related to the application talking to the MongoS and the MongoS talking back. So in other words, we'll do this in orange, you need to allow these, not necessarily allow those. Okay, and in a microcosm, that's what you have to do for everything else. So I'm not going to go through what's allowed, what's not. I'm not going to draw in the ones that are disallowed. What I'm going to do is I'm going to draw in the ones that have to be allowed. And as you'll see, generally what you're going to want to do is, after you get past this MongoS layer here, is essentially allow everything to talk to everything else, because there's functionality that requires it. Okay. Let's walk through it really quickly so that if you're explaining this to a NetOps person, you'll be able to do something similar. The MongoS's must be able to talk to the primaries. That's a given. How else would you write data? Any secondary can become a primary. Therefore, all MongoS's need to be able to talk to all members of a replica set. All members of replica sets need to be able to talk to each other. Okay, replica set heartbeats, transferring of data between them for replication, any secondary can become primary, etc., etc. So the inter-replica set communication has to be both ways, and connections have to be able to be initiated from both directions. Now, it is also true that this direction of connections has to be allowed. Now in the future that might go away, but there is a feature that occurs in a sharded environment, which means that a connection outbound from the primary, and hence any of the rest of them, back to the MongoS is occasionally required. So the MongoS has to be able to talk to every member of the replica set. Every member of the replica set has to be able to talk to the MongoS, and every member of the replica set internally has to be able to talk to each other. So essentially, whatever ports you're running these on, bidirectional rules to allow connections to be established in both directions, not just related ones. Okay, what about cross-sharding? Well, we know that when we're doing a migration, that the primaries have to be able to talk to each other. This primary sends this one a command. That one starts reading from this one. And because any member of a replica set can become primary, and let's ignore hidden members and things like that for now, any member of a replica set can become primary, therefore they all have to be able to talk to each other. And I won't draw in all the lines here. Let's just, let your imagination fill in the meshed connections that have to happen between the shards. Okay? And then we have the config servers. Where do they come into play? Well, we also know from our anatomy of a migration segment that the primaries have to be able to talk to the config servers. Therefore, all members of the replica set have to be able to talk to the config servers, and they will need related connections as well. I'm not 100% sure whether the config servers will ever open a connection in this direction, but there could be some edge cases where that actually does happen. I'm thinking of health checks that might need to happen. So you may not need this particular one, the config servers back into the shards. You certainly will need the shards out to the config servers and related connections there. The MongoS's, of course, must be able to talk to the config servers and then related connections there as well. So when you look at the entire cluster, when you take the whole thing as a picture, it really is a case, there's only a couple of exceptions where you don't allow bidirectional opening of connections. And if you start running different processes on the same host, it gets even more complicated. So as a general rule, the only things you're going to deny are bidirectional connections between the MongoS and the config servers, because these will never make a connection that way. And you may be able to get away with not having the config servers able to open a connection into the primary. But if you just wanted to be safe, it's two directions, two additional rules to allow to remove all doubt that everything can talk to everything else. So with the level of communication going on in a sharded cluster, what you should generally look at is everything from the MongoS down, including the config servers. You should just all be able to talk to each other. That's your safest bet there. There's a couple of things you can take out, but it's not exactly extensive. And you can think of your MongoS's as your gatekeepers. So those are the ones you're going to really want to pay attention to and make sure they're locked down. These guys can be basically completely firewalled off from the app servers and anyone else, and the whole thing can still function. So if you like, we can draw that in. We'll draw it in green. We haven't used that one too much. So if you wanted to, you could kind of cordon off everything behind those green dots from everything except the MongoS's, lock that down, and consider this your trusted network, which is referred to multiple times in our documentation and of course referred to by Dwight as well. So this is the bit you want to make sure is nice and secure, trusted, doesn't have a lot of access from the outside. The S, you can consider them as sort of in your demilitarized zone or whichever way you do your zonings, and then tightly control the access to those and the access they have in here, and you'll have a nice and secure setup from the networking perspective.